The Antifada is more than a podcast. It's a specter haunting the globe.
It is the synthesis of the two most frightening things for the cheerleaders of this reactionary hell world.
One ravaged by the unbounded savagery of capital and its states.
Antifa super soldiers and Intifada.
Bash the bash in a global uprising.
Be prepared to enter
The Antifada mindset. I'm Jamie Peck.
I'm Sean KB.
And I'm AP Andy.
And we are recording not live at the New School University, just steps from the gentrification-ravaged Lower East Side, in a student-occupied cafeteria in the dark heart of American Empire, downtown Manhattan, USA.
That's right, and we are proud to present our guest today, a student occupier named Kay. Say hello.
Hello.
We're here sitting right now in a pretty quiet space. This is our first time that Antifada has actually got on the road together and recorded. We thought that student occupation combined with student struggles is a really great opportunity for us to get out from under Sam Cedar's thumb and get out into the world. So to kind of paint the picture of what we're seeing here, students and workers have occupied this cafeteria on 5th Avenue and 14th Street in Manhattan. There are signs everywhere outside. And as you walk up the steps and into the cafeteria area, there are tons of posters and pamphlets and stickers and folks in various levels of activity, as the students have taken a very, very strong stand, not just using their leverage as students to push politics forward, but also in defense of both cafeteria workers and also graduate students, both of whom are attempting right now to get good union contracts.
So, I figured I'd start with some basic questions, who are you, what year? You don't have to tell us any personally identifying information if you don't want to, but how did you get involved with this action here?
Okay, well, I'm a junior here at the new school. This is my first year here. I got involved because some of the cafeteria workers were outside flyering, and they were handing out information about what was going on and how they were going to lose their jobs, and I met Prince, and I was talking to him about what was going on. He's one of the cafeteria workers. And he said that they were trying to organize an occupation of the cafeteria, and I was like, all right, well, I'm totally there. It sounds like a very good cause. I don't live on campus. I didn't really eat in the cafeteria at all, but yeah.
You were hyped by the opportunity to jump in to a really good struggle on behalf of these folks.
Yeah, I mean, they're also really nice people, so.
I imagine as students, you said you don't eat at the cafeteria all the time, but the folks that make and prepare and serve the food here are an important aspect of the community here at the university, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them have been here longer than most students have, so as students cycle out, they are technically the backbone of the community because they are there, and they do form very meaningful relationships with students that they appreciate and also students appreciate, so I think they have much more of a claim to the space in the school than even some of the students do.
Hell yeah.
So how did this action begin? How did it develop into what's happening right now?
So I wasn't involved in the original organizing that was done by the communist student group and the Maoist student group. From what I know, they went around and they talked to cafeteria workers, and they decided to hold this occupation on May Day.
International Workers' Day. Good
Yes.
day for a fight.
Yeah, definitely, and it's lasted for about 2 weeks now, so.
Wow, how is everybody holding up here?
It's been really nice. I came in here not knowing anybody, but now we're kind of like a family. We all take care of each other. Most of us are still going through finals, so we're doing finals and the occupation, and we're continuing to organize. So there's definitely a lot on all of our plates, and no one sleeps that much, but we're trying the best we can.
Wow, that's really impressive. I remember when I was in college and I was going through finals, and I just didn't do anything else. In fact, funny story, people were talking about the transit workers strike the other day that happened. What year was that?
2003.
Apparently it was pretty big. And
They shut the subways down for 3 days.
And I was in New York at that point in time, and I'm like, why do I have no memory of this? Oh, it was during finals week.
Yeah.
It started and ended while I was in the library, and I just didn't even know.
Damn, you're old.
Not to date myself or anything, guys.
And all of our college student listeners right now are all getting anxious just thinking about finals as they're trying to enjoy a nice podcast. So it's nice of us to give them that.
But some of the students here, I've heard, are taking incompletes. They're losing their jobs.
I mean, that's definitely been very stressful. I know that over the past 2 weeks, I haven't gone to work as much as I need to, so obviously that is something to worry about. People have talked about taking incompletes, but a lot of people we're still working to finish all of our papers and our finals, so we're kind of trying to power through and get everything done, which might be a bit of a stretch, but I think it's hopefully doable.
Well, that's, I think that there's real sacrifices being made by folks, but they're righteous sacrifices and a righteous struggle. Go ahead, Andy.
And speaking of, you said earlier there's a lot on your plates. A huge part of this occupation has been replacing the labor of the cafeteria workers who are on strike, and have been paid for the entire time that they've been out. Actually using the cafeteria to make meals for anyone who comes to the occupation, 3 meals a day plus snacks every day, which is really impressive. Can you talk a little bit about organizing that and how it's gone?
Yeah, you literally have a lot on your plates, huh?
You're plating. Someone's doing the demi-gloss. They're wiping the plates down, putting the garnish on top and everything like that.
A little balsamic reduction.
Yeah, some serious Zagat guide shit right here. So go ahead.
So originally, it just kind of happened. One morning, myself and another student got up and someone donated all this food to us, and we were like, oh, what do we do with this food? So we decided to just put it out on plates and for people in the occupation, because the first night we had a lot of people sleeping over. And then we noticed that a lot of students were walking by and were kind of confused why the cafeteria was occupied, and they were very concerned about where they were going to eat. So we kind of all decided that we should start making food for free and giving it to students, not just in the occupation, but everywhere, as a way to kind of make sure everyone's needs are met, but still disrupt what was happening, and also to take away any profit that they could make off of the cafeteria. So we've been using dining dollars, which is just like the cafeteria money, I guess, off campus to buy food, and also we have a Venmo account which people have donated to, so we go on grocery runs and buy food and make meals. It's been a really awesome thing.
And we'll make sure that we put that Venmo information in the show notes so that if people are interested in donating, they could do so.
Nice.
So one comparison I'd like to make that's really interesting is that this is similar to what you saw in these rolling teacher strikes across the country over the last couple of months, where teachers, while they were on strike, obviously, children and parents were not getting the services, that they needed. So teachers were stepping up out of their own pocket and with their own time in order to provide things like meals and childcare and things of this sort, so that, even though they're out on strike for their own rights and for workers' rights in general, they're also aware that the community still has needs, right? And so we can provide that ourselves, try to create a sort of grassroots way of doing that so that people can still get the things done that they need to get done, but workers can get a contract and the struggle can continue.
Yeah, like a lot of what happens when people go out on strike, I think, especially like teachers, is whoever is trying to end the strike is like, look what they're doing to people. How
Think of the children.
How could you do this? Think of the children. How could you do this to the kids who rely on school for free lunch or the cafeteria here? And like, that's a really, really good way to, both because it's the right thing to do and because it's strategically wise.
That's right.
I mean, the workers were also involved. Prince was teaching me how to use the hot plates and also the deep fryer. Sadly, they turned off all the gas and they shut off a bunch of the power and the sockets in the kitchen. So it is kind of a hard space to work in, but since the workers did teach us how to kind of make do with some of the equipment that was already there, we've kind of been able to take it over and do whatever we want.
Wow, that's pretty neat, especially considering, like, I guess, I don't know if irony is the correct word for this, but like, I know they were trying to pit students against the cafeteria workers by saying they were going to replace them in some of their jobs. And students were like, no, that's ridiculous. And now they are doing those jobs, but only in support of the cafeteria workers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main point behind that was pitting students against workers, but also the whole unionization aspect, to get rid of the unionized cafeteria workers. But yeah, I mean, it's been pretty cool though. I mean, I like cooking, so yeah, it's been pretty fun.
And have you been sleeping here consistently for the whole 2 weeks?
Yeah, I've slept here every single night.
Wow.
Wow.
And how many people are the core group of all day, all night occupiers, would you say?
I would say probably around 20 people. That's a rough estimate.
And what's
though.
the most you've ever had on one night?
I think the first night, I can't give you a number, but the first night we definitely had a lot of people in the cafeteria. There was not that much space for people to sleep, but it was kind of like no one really cared about that.
And you do have a lot of air mattresses, a lot of blankets, but unfortunately, no way to turn off the lights.
Oh man.
Yeah, there's a few things that we've kind of made jokes about, like the lights. We can turn the lights off in the cafeteria itself, but not the outside. So we're like, oh, it's an intimidation tactic. They're trying to keep the lights on all the time to make us forget what time of day. And then there's also this grease trap in the dishwasher room that smells really bad, so we make the joke that like, oh, they're trying to like make it smell bad, so we'll leave. Or they turn the heat down and we're like, they're trying to freeze us out. So there's kind of just like a lot of jokes around that. I mean, it's fine, we do have a lot of beds and blankets, but yeah.
Well, that's actually interesting because another question that we had was, how is the administration and the management of this food service company here dealing with this situation? What's their reaction? What's their position? What have they said to folks, not just workers, but also students?
Students, they really, as far as campus-wide, they haven't really said much. They've released a few emails, but only when they do something good. So within the first couple days around, they announced that they would be hiring the workers back, but the next day they rescinded that. But they only sent an email out how they were going to hire the workers back and not. So it's been kind of hard to combat all the emails and newsletters that they do send out because it makes people think that the occupation's not going on, or even with the grad students, it's the strike's not going on because the emails are like, oh, well, we negotiated or we settled or it stopped. So that's kind of difficult because they have access to the whole school and we don't. But we have been putting up a shit ton of posters everywhere. Sadly, a lot of them that are in very visible places, like in the front of the school, have been taken down.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, how you guys are getting the word out. Are you using social media? Are you creating your own alternative networks?
We have social media accounts on basically all of the main things. We have a Twitter, a Facebook group. Someone also does Snapchat. So we are kind of trying to put the word out through that. Also trying to use like the new school hashtag to reach people who aren't necessarily within the occupation, who might go to the new school or looking something up so they could stumble upon that information. Also, people coming into this space will obviously find out about it. Sometimes they're really shocked and they're like, what the heck is going on? But that's also good. We've kind of been dealing with a lot of people giving very negative feedback, but I think that if it can make them feel something, even if it is complete anger or disgust or inconvenience, at least they are feeling something and kind of like acknowledging the situation.
Yeah, who is giving you that feedback? Is it other students?
Yeah, there's been some students who have said stuff like, oh, well, that's such a waste of printing credits to print all these posters, or like,
Oh my God.
yeah, people can be pretty harsh, or they're like, oh, you guys are ruining everything because I can't go to get breakfast in the morning, which we're like, well, we're making you breakfast anyway, so like, there's not much to complain about. I mean, students do have different opinions on stuff.
It's a very wide-ranging university, right?
Yes.
It goes from Parsons to Lang to New School for Social Research. There's also a
People might not
Manus.
know what that
here,
is,
right?
babe.
COPA,
Yeah.
Manus.
There's a fashion school, right?
fashion school, liberal arts school, jazz school, performing arts school, and then New School for Social Research, which is like kind of liberal. I don't know how to describe social research stuff.
So so it's not just that the administration has a stranglehold on information. It's also that there's people in all these different divisions within the university, so there's some sort of separation between the students themselves anyways.
Yeah.
So it's kind of difficult to bring folks together, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, we've tried, a few days we've done, like, classroom interruptions where we'll go and knock on the door and ask the professor, hey, can we make an announcement? So we were doing that before the strike started, and also during the occupation to tell them about, like, don't cross the picket lines, or, this is why the strike's going on, this is how you can support it, and, like, even if you do have class or finals, there are other ways you can support it. Some people were pretty receptive, other people were not. So we did have some debates with some students and professors who weren't necessarily as into it as they could have been and were supportive, but there were also a lot of people who were. So
I talked to a student the other day. I was at the picket line, and she just needed to print out her paper.
Yeah.
And she was really concerned about crossing the picket line.
That's
and
great.
she's like, does anyone know where I can go to print my paper where I
Yeah.
won't be crossing the picket line? And one of my DSA comrades helped her.
Yeah, we've been trying to come up with alternative ways of doing that. We've been like, there's coffee shops where you can go work. You can also go to the NYU library because we do have access to that library. I think it's a matter of people don't want to be inconvenienced and have to go somewhere else, but there's definitely a lot of options.
Cool. We have a few more questions written down here. Have there been any internal divisions since this started? Like, how's everyone getting along?
I think that with movements, it's very important to internally critique yourselves, because I think that can only make you stronger. There has been some divisions between students who aren't associated with any group and students who are associated with groups such as the Student Communist Party and the Maoist group, but I think that's because we have different reasons for being here or different motivations behind it. But I think ultimately, a bunch of people with a bunch of different political ideologies were able to come together and create this movement. So I think that we're a lot more united than we are divided.
In the course of these 2 weeks, what were the processes that you put in place in order to do decision making, between these different groups, between these different factions of students?
So the communist student group definitely took the lead in the beginning a lot, but then there was some pushback against it because people wanted to be better represented and better involved in the organizing and a bunch of other stuff. So we ended up breaking off into different committees and having general assemblies either once or twice a day to kind of go over what had happened during the day or plans for later. So we have like a security committee with people who deal with people coming in and out, or a strategy committee for escalation or de-escalation tactics, a media committee, a kitchen committee. So we kind of all broke off into little groups in order to support everything.
Cool.
Do you have anything?
Well, we haven't mentioned yet that you won almost all of your demands, right?
Yes, a lot of the demands have been met, but it's only an agreement. It's not a contract. They're not willing to negotiate any further, but one of the main demands is that the head chef has been sexually harassing some people in the kitchen. There have been workers who have come forward and voiced this concern with a lot of the students. So that's one of our main demands that's not being met because obviously it would be very bad press for the new school, but also the union seems to think it's a more internal issue that they should deal with. But a lot of the workers, people shouldn't feel unsafe in their workplace, and people shouldn't be getting sexually harassed in their workspace. Also, there was like a whole thing about how he doesn't clean fry baskets or whatever, so sometimes he'll fry vegan food with things that have been touching meats or cheeses. So a lot of people.
I used to be vegan, and
Yeah.
I would not like that.
Yeah.
Also, people who are halal
Oh,
and kosher, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
people are very not happy over that as well, because one of the workers, Joy, she was like, you all might think that you're vegetarians or vegans or kosher, but guess what I'm telling you? If you've been eating here, you're not anymore.
Oh, there's pork in
Oh,
everything.
no.
And
Yeah.
this
You
is
can't
a very
unknow something like that.
vegetarian, vegan-oriented school.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who
Yeah.
Wow.
support that.
What I think is impressive is that what you're doing in that demand in order to try to get this guy removed is you're crossing the bounds of what is supposed to be acceptable. You're not supposed to be able to democratically decide or through protest decide what management is allowed to do in terms of who they hire to run things, right? You're breaking into this sort of managerial prerogative, this managerial right to choose who they want to have to run the place. And just by putting that demand in, you're automatically sort of scrambling, the kind of hierarchies that exist within a workplace. And I find that very impressive.
Yeah, like, did the union know about this guy? Did they have a chance to deal with him and they just weren't?
I mean, it has been revealed that he was transferred from his previous jobs over, allegations is a shitty word, but over sexual harassment before, so it's not as if he hasn't done this before. I guess you can kind of compare it to the whole priest thing where they just kind of move people around and don't deal with the issue. I honestly don't know what information the union has or how they have, I mean, obviously I don't think they've attempted to deal with it, but I don't have that information.
Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to the shortfalls of unions sometimes, especially when they're organized in a top-down way, in terms of protecting people against stuff like that. Like, I remember a big article came out, like, during the height of Me Too, when, which company was it? It's like a car company. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Oh, yeah, so it was at the Ford plant in Chicago, where a bunch of women workers had their sexual harassment complaints basically swept under the rug. And it took until this Times story came out, and I imagine, some bottom-up action, because they had to decide to speak on the record about it in order to fix this problem. And now, guess what? They're fixing it.
There is certainly a strong left critique of the top-down bureaucratic and conservative nature of unions, but one thing that can be said for them is that they are open to reform, and they are open to some degree of workers' democracy. If you don't have a union, there's no way that folks are going to get together and address issues like sexual harassment, on the job, or any other issue, right? So just to have that in place shows that you have a basis for workers' power. Now, whether you use it or not, is a question that's based on the social forces and the degree of consciousness that folks have. But there has actually been, it leads me to another point, there's been a strike here, right? An actual strike?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So there's the graduate student union, SENS, which is united with the United Auto Workers. So they're having a strike because they have first, I think it was 2 years ago, or recently, in recent history, they were attempting to unionize as student workers, and the school wouldn't let them, so they went through legal means, because they said, you can't legally stop us from unionizing, so that's been a whole ordeal. And then they were asking for health care and higher wages, because a lot of graduate students work multiple jobs, and when you're teaching and you're doing something else, and also doing your dissertation, that's a lot to put on someone's plate. So they went to the negotiation table, from my knowledge, way too many times, and none of their demands were being met, so they decided to call the strike, even though they'd been planning it for months in advance. It's been pretty cool. I went to the picket lines every day also. It's pretty fun.
I think at least 2 out of 3 members of Antifada crew have joined the picket lines.
I was on the picket lines.
All right, 3 out of 3. That ain't bad. All of Antifada has been on the picket lines.
Hell yeah.
Ourselves. We came down to support on the first day, and we'll do so in the future for all pickets.
Yeah, I came a couple times, actually. I came on May 1st with the DSA, and we came and sang some songs. And
That was pretty awesome.
Awesome. Yeah, it seemed like a good vibe in there.
Yeah.
And then we came back the other day after the building trades rally in Union Square, brought a few Sean's hard hat buddies over, and did some more picketing.
One thing that we should talk about is sort of the interesting convergence of these two strikes, because the cafeteria workers, the school's plan, and they phrase this in this very we're kind of liberal, we're going to do something good for the community kind of way of, we're going to get rid of this contract with Chartwell's, which is an outside food contractor, and replace it with in-house food service, so everything's going to be local, more organic.
Yeah, they
We're
did
going
say
to
that.
decide as a community what kind of
Greenwashing.
food, and the food's going to be made by people in the community. And what this means, of course, is it's going to be made by academic student workers, workers who are, maybe getting a little bit off their tuition, but much more heavily exploited than a full-time worker that currently works in the cafeteria. And this has basically been the strategy of private universities and public universities in the United States for a long time, of having a sort of hybrid student worker class that is heavily exploited to be TAs, to be RAs, to have the school function without paying people a fair wage.
And like, I'm sure you guys are doing a great job cooking, but like, this isn't unskilled labor. Like, I talked to a student the other day who was like, it's not safe to have a student who doesn't know what they're doing run an industrial-sized grill.
I mean, we can't use the industrial-sized grills. We're using hot
It might be
plates.
for the best.
Yeah, I mean, there were safety concerns about that. I mean, I've been cooking most of my life. I know that I need to wash my hands and wear gloves and like stuff. But yeah, that has been a concern that sadly not many of us, if not all of us, don't necessarily have the proper certifications that are required by the state, which we're kind of like, don't shut us down. But
Oh, I mean, I was talking about like what the university was trying to do.
Oh, yeah, the university, that's also messed up.
Like, you guys are definitely doing your best under difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I think that what the university was trying to do is just trying to save money and also exploit more students, but
I think what's interesting, and you pointed to this, Kay, and Andy mentioned it too, is the propaganda aspect of it and the use of ideology for it, because, there was a degree of greenwashing, as they call it, right? Because they're saying everything's gonna be locally sourced, and we'll be able to kind of like have more organic and natural produce, and we're not going through this big Chartwell corporation. Very similar to what Israel does, for example, with pink washing, right? Saying, oh, we're the most friendly LGBT country, in that entire region, so clearly we must be doing nothing wrong. But also this concept too that, we're going to insource things back into the community instead of them having, being outsourced to this union Chartwell company. Well, there's a real reason why the student community here in downtown Manhattan, and if folks don't know, the area around the new school is a very, very expensive area. The Union Square area, the West Village area, the East Village area, the Lower East Side area. I'm pretty certain that unless there is public housing provision, that the people who are working in the cafeteria, even for union wages, are not part of, quote unquote, the community because they can't live in Manhattan down here in this. They're coming from maybe from Flatbush, maybe from the Bronx, they're maybe coming from New Jersey, right? So this conception that, we want, things to happen and be produced closer to here with people who are more involved, I think goes to show how striking the difference between the students and the workers are in a sense. But what you've been able to do is overcome that divide, right? By saying we refuse to essentially scab on these good union workers and replace their jobs and be exploited ourselves for something they should be able to feed their families with and pay their bills with.
Yeah, like what does that even mean? Is there a farm in the East Village that they're getting the produce from now?
They actually, if you go out into the cafeteria, there's this designed picture of turning the cafeteria into a green space and like planting plants. I don't know if that's where they're going to grow their vegetables, but it's like hanging plants all over the place. But we also we make a lot of jokes because that's how we get by. But we also made the joke that if we continue the occupation, and since we're kind of running the kitchen as our own little co-op, that the school would try to co-opt that and be like, look, our students are being self-sufficient and they're making like their own food. This is why we should do it. Or, like, totally selling point. I can see it too.
Well, this is the roots of the Social Justice Center upstairs, right? There was because there's been a history of occupations at this school in 2008, 2009, and 2011. And in 2011, because in 2008, 2009, the administration just arrested people. Yeah. In 2011, they had like a slightly nicer president, David Van Zandt. Still the same policies, but like a friendlier face on them. And
I am President Jerry Brown.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ted Kennedy reference going.
And he said, okay, students should have a space where they can, write on the walls and organize and do whatever they want.
Knock yourselves out.
But
there's a ball pit. You could pretend you're throwing Molotovs, but they
yeah, but it has to be very controlled and out of the way of any actual functioning of the school. And so when they rebuilt this building on the 5th floor, there's something called the Social Justice Center, which I saw for the first time the other day.
How was it?
It was there. There's just all these lists of rules on the walls about like who's allowed to go in there.
No, they recently there was a fight by students of color to make it an affinity space, or part of it an affinity space for students of color, which was a very long fight that people had, but they were able to make part of it that, which also goes into the struggle of everything else that's going on, because a lot of people did not like that or thought they were being excluded. But it's like, get over your white fragility that you can't go into a space like you don't use every classroom. You don't go into the Parsons classes if you're at Lang. Like, it's just one space that you're not going to use that other people need. So.
Well, to be clear, that's a room within the Social Justice Center. So when I first entered the Social Justice Center, there's this. It says this is a space for, and there's like, 15 categories, and I believe that's actually supposed to include everyone. It doesn't like anyone's allowed to go into that room. But then there's a room inside of the room that says this is not for cis white men. This is for indigenous people, people of color, queer people, etc. But the effect of that, although I agree with the sense that there should be this space that is somewhat exclusive, is that you're just entering a space that's just filled with like regulations and identities, and there's no sense of what else that space is meant to be for.
I mean, it wasn't being. I mean, basically, they want to use it for identity student groups to have meetings there, because although it is called the Social Justice Hub, most people who use it were just studying there. It wasn't actually being used for any political action or planning or whatever. So by making
it was a real success then.
Yeah,
because
for them.
There's 2 or 3 years of student struggle. They managed to contain it into a space that then ended up becoming emptied of most political content at the end of the day. So I guess
I bet they put that in the brochures, though.
Yeah, I mean, they plug that they have a social justice hub, but most people don't use it that way.
Now that brings me to another question, Kay, because I think the new school in general tries to brand itself as a very open-minded and free and liberal environment for study. Do you think that their attempt to portray themselves as a very woke university, as a very inclusive university, as a very socially just university has actually given you some leverage because you've been able to push back against that narrative?
I mean, it can be hard working within neoliberalism because they will always try to flip it and be like, look at our brochures, look at all the diversity on our brochures. And it's like, well, when you actually do come into this space, it is a majority white space. You cannot avoid that. Or, I think it's kind of hard. It's a lot harder within universities that brand themselves that way, because I think people are less likely to believe you. They'll be like, oh, well, it's an inclusive space, or it's a social justice space. So when you're like, oh, well, this racist thing is happening, or this other thing is happening, they're like, well, not at this school. And it's like, well, yes, at this school, because we're still in a white supremacist society, even if you're within these 4 walls. So, you can't just get away with that because your school says it's inclusive.
Now, you say that the vast majority of the students are white. Would you say that the security guards, the janitorial staff, and the cafeteria workers are all white?
No, they're all people of color. The majority of them are. Yeah.
So there's a real division, a real divide there.
Yeah.
So that's part of one of the things you've had to overcome, right? Not only pointing out to the administration and university and students and everybody that it's actually, there is an issue where if you have the working people at this university who do the day in and day out work that it takes in order to make it run, and they're working class, mostly people of color, right, on the one hand, and then you claim diversity on the other hand, and you have almost all white students, right? Clearly there is still a split, there's still a division there, a racial division of labor that happens within the university, right?
Yeah, definitely. Also, most of the departments, the majority of professors are white also, which is kind of, it's bad because you shouldn't really be, this is a whole nother debate, but you probably should not be having white people teaching the history of slavery or some other classes that, people of color could teach in a lot more effective way. And that's not to say that all labor should come down to people of color educating other people. It's just to say that there's way too much whiteness and investing in whiteness in all the departments.
It also kind of puts a lie to a lot of critics, I think, want to paint an action like this as like a bunch of privileged kids or privileged white kids, students who are like out of touch with reality, just like doing naive things with their privilege, but like you're using your privilege for good, because like a lot of these workers probably don't have the ability to like occupy a space for days on end because they have families to take care of, and it just seems like a really inspiring example of like cross-class solidarity or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, there's still been some issues that have arisen in the space, obviously, because there's still issues at the university which have been not hard to overcome, but have caused some splits and debates. Debates are always great, as long as you attempt to resolve them in a way that everybody understands.
Yeah, in terms of what's happening right now and what you all want to see happen in the near future, like what are your current prospects?
Well, we have been talking about whether we want to continue occupying this space or not, and if the struggle, or this movement, if you can call it a movement, if it's contingent on being in a particular space or on taking direct action. So we have been talking about whether we want to stop occupying or not, but we definitely want to do it on our terms and not the administration's terms. They recently asked us to vacate peacefully.
That sounds like a threat.
Yeah, it was worded just like, yeah, students, please vacate peacefully. And we're like, no, we're not going to leave because you told us to. So we're working on tactics to exit, not to end everything that's going on, but to exit the physical space, to work on other strategies of hopefully gaining leverage over the administration, hopefully to get the chef fired, because that's the one thing that mainly hasn't been met. So we've been talking about like, oh, if he doesn't get fired, we can like go in every day and like heckle him or something like that, or find out other ways. We've started social media campaigns to get more people to notice, because hopefully parents, I mean, I don't know any parent who would want their child in a space with a person like that, or also, like, more importantly, workers should not be in a space like that. So we have been working on a lot of tactics to move forward into the future. Whether that means we continue to occupy or not, we're not entirely sure. That's a current open debate, but we're still hoping to continue a lot longer.
And as this semester winds down and a lot of folks go away for the summertime, I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of talk in that period, in that time, about what's going to happen on the first day of fall semester, right? I'm assuming people want to hit the ground running.
Right now we're mainly working on what we're going to do, because a lot of people are making plans to head home. And since we are currently occupying this space, that would leave us very vulnerable. So we're trying to think of immediate things, and then once we cover all the immediate issues that we're facing, then we're going to work on a plan over the summer for when school starts up again.
How can people follow what's going on with the occupation?
Yeah, and help. How can people help?
So we do have all the social media platforms, so sharing all that information would be really good, donating to the Venmo, but also people can come stop by, like the Social Democrats have come, the anarchists have had a whole meeting here. We've had a lot of people coming through to support us. We were having teach-ins almost every day, so we've had people from Occupy Wall Street stop in. Today there was a teach-in with the West Virginia teachers who came. So we are getting a lot of people involved, and we're hoping to have more teach-ins and inviting more people into the space, whether they do go to the new school or not. So if anyone is in the area and they want to check it out, then that would also be amazing.
And we'll be sure to put all those links in the podcast description for the show.
Yeah, I mean, we're not the biggest podcast in the world, but we're going to do our part to spread the word.
That's right.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Solidarity.
Forever.
Solidarity forever.
Hell yeah.
You know.
Got drunk with the girls from the local art school. Got caught painted on the wall. Chest at the circle with spoonfuls and shot them down with bottles of rocket fuel. I got the idea there was no thing I couldn't do. I got the idea that I could stay
So, it's now a little bit later, And I thought we should go back and contextualize some of the actions that we've been seeing and dealing with at the new school, because we like to think big here at the Antifada, and we like to ground our discussions in history. And luckily, we have a couple of experts here today. So
Hello.
Hey, Andy. Space Roll.
Andy talks now. It's fucking great. So, yeah, I thought I would ask a few open-ended questions to get the ball rolling in this conversation. So, like, what is the history of the university itself? Maybe you want to start by talking about that and the different roles it's played in society through time.
Yeah, sure. I think that's actually a really good way to take the particular of this university struggle and try to generalize it. And I always personally like to go back to history, because I think that you can't really understand where we're at unless you understand where we came from. An entire history of the university or higher education would take us back about 2,300 years to 21 BC with ancient China. We don't have to go there.
BCE, please.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the secularization of that, because that's actually something we'll talk about. There have been higher education structures, obviously, the gymnasia that were in Greece, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, all that good stuff. You had madrasas that came in the Middle East, large one actually in Africa, in Timbuktu, one of the greatest centers of learning, the Library of Alexandria. You had university-type structures in India and elsewhere. But to focus just on the West, and in particular the United States, because I think that kind of grounds us in what we're looking at when we talk about the modern university. Universities arrive in the Middle Ages. That's very important because the word university comes from the Latin word universitas, which essentially means a corporation or an association or a guild. And so in the medieval period, when universities were first arriving in their modern form in Europe, it was essentially an association or a guild of students and teachers who came together to self-manage a learning process in a time when mostly that was theology, right? Because obviously the church was a huge influence at that time. If you push things forward and then you bring things to the United States, of course, the first universities that arrived, does anyone know what the first university in the U.S. was?
I do not.
Park the car at Harvard.
Harvard?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yale was actually, interestingly, Yale was the second. Yale was a Harvard, which was formed by the Puritans as a theological seminary, actually chartered by the state of Massachusetts, the colony. The teachers and students started to get a little bit too radical for their puritanical thought. They started to get a little liberal in their theology for the late 17th century. So
SJWs.
Yes, exactly. They ruined a good thing. These uppity students decided to start, bringing some
Showing their ankles off and everything.
all sorts of risque behavior.
It was probably all men, but they weren't supposed to show their ankles either.
And they were not supposed to condemn things like burning women, or any of that stuff. So Yale actually started as a orthodox breakaway from Harvard, interestingly. So again, to move things forward very, very quickly, because there's a lot of history here, you have these original private universities that are somewhat, associated with the colonies and certainly associated with religion and Protestantism specifically, until right after the Revolution, with the first basically secularized public university in the United States, which is the University of Virginia. And that was founded by Jefferson, great bourgeois revolutionary. Certainly was problematic on many issues, including race issues and Native American issues, but he was a strong secularist, he was an Enlightenment figure, and he did fight in the U.S. Revolution and helped form the Constitution, all that good stuff. So you start to see the university in a small way come as a secularized institution, away from theology, more about liberal arts. And the next great bourgeois revolutionary figure named Abraham Lincoln comes along in 1862, and he forms a land grant program, which essentially sets aside land so that states can have their own public universities, right? The whole system that we know of today as the state university system goes way back to the period of the Civil War. Now, are you following me so far? This isn't too much too fast, or any questions?
Lincoln did some good stuff.
Lincoln was all right, and what's his face? Jefferson, yeah, he was decent too. They were kind of at the forefront of the creation of the U.S. secular university, right? Not theology. We're going to deal with things like originally in the land grant colleges, it was about agriculture was the big thing. What we would term, I think now, agronomy. You know, studying better ways to make crops as in a big agrarian nation, right? Later, engineering becomes a thing in universities to go along with the liberal arts conception. So the university remains a very, very small part of not just education, but life in the United States. So in the year 1900, there's only 160,000 students in university in the entire United States.
Who were these students? Were they mainly from the upper classes?
Yes, it was a very, very rarefied group of people. When you think of Harvard and Yale and Brown and Princeton, right, these original universities, you think of WASPs, and you think of a upper crusty, snobbish education in the classics and the liberal arts, right?
Yeah.
I'm picturing Mr. Burns in his Yale uniform.
As well you should. He was probably class of, I don't know, 1930
Yeah,
or
Columbia
1913.
too. They've got the names of all those old dead white men right up there on the library, you know?
They sure as
on
fuck
the
did.
ionic columns of the library.
It is quite a beautiful library and a beautiful campus. If you go to all of these, I think you can really see the history of the university express itself in the architecture, right? It's not for nothing that things look very old, they look medieval, they look austere, but they look, you know, like a place of learning, like what we would imagine a place for free inquiry and free thought would look like, right?
Yeah, I mean, Low Library at Columbia looks like the Pantheon. And I know that because I had to study ancient Greek and Roman architecture there.
See, that's a little left over from the old classical education. That's certainly Columbia and a lot of the private schools still have. Public schools, it's changing a bit, as we'll see.
They got a real hard-on for those ancient Greeks.
Who doesn't? So the real sea change, and what brings us to basically the implantation of the university as not just a very important rite of passage for young American people, many young American people, not all, but also as a kind of cultural touchstone for understanding what it means to be upwardly mobile, you know, to be a middle-class American, as they say. We only really get to that point in the post-war period, right, after the Second World War. And of course, the impetus for that is GI Bill basically offers for veterans of the war, especially white ones. It was a lot harder if you were a person of color, but it offered them opportunities to get housing in the suburbs. But very importantly, the GI Bill basically covered up to 80% of the cost of one of these very cheap public university for all veterans, which meant almost every single man of, you know, military age in the United States. So at this point in time, the university goes from a very rarefied thing meant to reproduce an upper class or ruling class in this country, and it becomes somewhat democratized, right? It becomes open to more and more people in the U.S. And with that, you see a massive influx of students, obviously, many of them coming from the more privileged sectors of the working class, and most especially, too, in this new 1950s and 60s economy, it's necessary to have more highly trained individuals coming out of these schools with certifications, because the economy is humming, right? The bourgeois economy is humming. You need more middle managers, professionals like doctors and lawyers. You need more and more of them too with the baby boom. And so essentially, by the 1960s, the university becomes this institution in American life, and it becomes one that more and more people are having access to.
I think my grandpa actually benefited from that after the war, because he was pretty poor. He grew up in, am I going to get this wrong, Newark, the Jewish ghetto where Philip Roth was from too, and ended up getting his PhD from Yale after he came back from the war. And he would not have been able to do that if it weren't for all of these great public programs.
Yeah, they were, I think, specifically tailored to reorganize society, reorganize the economy as the United States came out of the Second World War, because the big fear amongst a lot of the ruling elites and certainly business people was that we'd be flung back into the Great Depression. Because for all the things that the New Deal did in order to ameliorate the, you know, poverty, the immiseration of a lot of people in the United States, it never actually solved the economic crisis of the Great Depression. So one of the ways that you could do that, right, is to essentially get people out into suburbs with all the ancillary costs that includes, like highways, cars, rubber, oil, houses, and all that good stuff, right? But also to basically react to a diversifying economy by pumping money into the higher education sector so that you can have a very diverse and skilled workforce in a growing economy. Follow me so far?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is like a school for school.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to do this not in lecture format.
I am falling asleep.
All right, you're falling asleep. Well, that's like all of us when we're sitting in class. I think what we're really interested in is two things, right? I talked about democratization, and then I talked about the early, I should say, history of the university as a guild structure, somewhat autonomous. The democratization of the higher education in the country in the 50s, 60s, and 70s makes it, like the rest of society, the rest of capitalist society, U.S. society, a site of struggle. You see this early with McCarthyism, as a lot of leftist professors are, basically thrown out of the universities. But then, of course, you see a reaction to that when the Cold War chills out a little bit in the 60s with the rise of mass student movements. And we're familiar with all of these, right? You have SDS. You obviously have the anti-Vietnam War protests that happen on campuses all over the place. You have mass student strikes that come from the killing of the kids at Kent State in 1970. The university now is not only a place of a rite of passage for American youth to become adults and pair and learn and things of this sort, it now also becomes something that's seen as a site of contestation where political forces collide, usually students from the left attempting to do things like kick ROTC off of their campus, protest the war, pull the levers of university power, occupy Columbia University, right?
Hell yeah.
In 1968, along
That
with the
happened.
Black Panthers and others. So we're familiar with this story.
Yeah.
But
I mean, here's a question. I know that McCarthyism kicked out the genuine radicals, and a lot of this was a counter-reaction to that, but I think in retrospect, even on the left, a lot of these student movements are sort of, shall we say, caricatured or like not, they don't get a lot of respect in terms of what they, both what they believed politically and how radical that actually was and what they achieved politically. Like, I've seen some documentaries, and you probably have too, about the rise of individualism in the 1960s and 70s and how that kind of became a very neoliberal phenomenon turned completely in service of capital. So, I don't know, you want to stick up for these folks here?
Well, I think that a lot of the reason why it's easy to caricature student movements now and certainly project that into the past is because the real gains that were won so many decades ago. So, if you're talking about this individualization that happens in the 1960s, right? The hippie generation turns into the me generation. The hippies turn into the yippies. The cycle of struggle dies down, turns into a much more individualistic one. And so I take your point to the extent that a lot of these radicals end up falling back into academia and actually becoming a left liberal force within academia that's much attacked, and maligned by people on the right today, because a lot of these folks, when they were done occupying buildings and done protesting and the Vietnam War was over, they had this great education and all this experience, but they didn't want to go be Joe Sixpack, right? They wanted to go and get a very fancy, high prestige job, which many of them did. But I think the greater point is that before that process happens, real gains were won. They did not stop the Vietnam War, but they did manage on many campuses to kick the ROTC out, which was is a group that basically tries to funnel people into the military system out of college. They did great protests, some of them successful, trying to get military industrial funding off of campuses. And then I think super important were the massive struggles that opened up gender studies departments, African American studies departments, all sorts of like decolonial or colonial studies departments. These were not given to students because they asked nicely or because some nice administrator decided that, all this black history in the United States has been erased for all these years. Let's create a nice department so that people can study about it. No, they were forced. At CUNY, the City University of New York, the African American Studies Department was forced by students occupying it in the 1970s.
This was a plot by the Frankfurt School.
Yes, it was a cultural Marxist thing.
The Frankfurt School forced them.
Yeah, pretty much. They went into exile in New York. Perhaps you can talk about that later. A university in exile, and that's from New York, actually, where all the media is. That's how they were able to spread their tentacles, if you can imagine, across the United States and the globe.
Yes, their protocols.
Yes, they had protocols.
Old men and their protocols.
Culture of Marxism.
The whole thing is crazy.
I mean, this was also an international phenomenon. Around 68, there are uprisings all over the world, often starting in universities. In Mexico, there was an entire summer of struggle that kicked off with anti-imperialist demonstrations supporting Cuba and against the bombing of Vietnam. And the police repression of those demonstrations and those occupations kind of snowballed and spread to secondary schools and high schools, spread to working class neighborhoods, to the point when there was a pre-revolutionary situation in Mexico City that continued for so long that the Mexican state literally just decided to kill all the students one day, hundreds. No one knows exactly how many, but because they were very good at covering up how many they killed, but in the hundreds in 68.
Live fire into a crowd of demonstrators.
And you saw similar reactions all over the world. You saw similar things throughout South America, Colombia, in Argentina. The university has always been sort of like a separate social class that tends to be the one that is the most anti-authoritarian when the state gets too much power, too dictatorial. And as a result of that, in a lot of places, travel police aren't allowed on campuses. And in Greece and Colombia, I'm not sure where else, but it's pretty common that there's kind of a privileged zone of political activity that's only in universities.
So here's a question then, is because we were talking about, SJWs as early as before the founding of this country. Is there something structural about the university that encourages radical or forward-thinking activities?
I would argue that this conception of the free exchange of ideas is obviously kind of a joke nowadays because it's this kind of right-wing hobby horse that's used in order to actually undermine left-wing speech all over the place. But I think there is something real and something powerful about people coming together in an environment and talking things out, talking literature, talking politics, talking culture, talking arts, talking science. And that, I think, is, in our idealized version of the university, the best that it can be. And it has been that for a lot of people for a lot of time. I think part of the dangers of the university, and this is where we're going to get to the backlash, part of the danger of the university is that it did become that with the democratization of it in the 60s and 70s. It was no longer an upper crusty an upper crusty institution that recreated a ruling class. It actually became a place where normal, everyday, working class and middle class kids, and professors could come together and bounce ideas around. And what we saw in the 60s and 70s was that that's very dangerous, right, for power.
Yeah, I mean, the kinds of violence, the kind of state violence that the state met these kids with makes me, it's a pretty good argument for the stakes being very high and the university actually playing a pretty significant role in society and in where society's going, no?
I'd say so, and to get to my structural and functionalist argument, whether it was in the Middle Ages, whether it was in early America, or whether it was up to the 60s and 70s or up until today, the university has functioned as a way to produce knowledge, but also to produce people who use that knowledge. And they produce people to do certain things. So it was produced to make priests at one point in time. Now it's produced to make doctors, lawyers, coders, and things of that sort. Now, of course, if you have this site of contestation, as you say, and Andy was talking about, where state violence is brought to bear against the people inside of that, you are going to have a backlash by the state, by capital, by right-wing actors who are going to try to shut that down. So soon after the 60s and 70s, and now into the 80s and 90s, the aughts and today, you see this massive backlash that's echoed in what you were talking about with these SJWs, this conception of the college as a very unserious political place where kids take things, way, way too seriously. They're way too into, pronouns or whatever the case may be. That was a concerted backlash, and also a backlash that tracked with changes within the economy, politics, and culture of this country. Because it should not be a surprise that when neoliberalism arises in the 70s and the 80s, that's when the university starts to shift. Those freedoms start to come under attack. And ultimately, and this is the important point, and the only reason I brought up the fucking Middle Ages, is that the autonomy of departments, right, which were run as the chairperson being the first among equals, right, professors basically self-managing the running of their departments, and the provost and president of a university typically being a very distinguished older professor, right? What you start to see is the bureaucratization of these universities. You start to see, a very top-heavy group of administrators arrive. You start to see funding cut for public universities. You start to see places like California, which is by the Constitution of California, I believe, supposed to be tuition free, now having, I think it's something like $15,000 worth of quote unquote fees every year, right, to get around this tuition thing. You start to see the liberal arts, especially in the last 20 years, language programs being cut, and everybody talking about STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, and math, as opposed to German or art or history or politics or political economy, whatever the case may be. This actually is the hand of capital and the state, I think very consciously but also very quietly working to destroy one of these last vestiges of thought and idea in this society. Not to idealize the university, right? Because ultimately the university has always been to produce workers, all right, or always been to reproduce classes, right? However, when you see corporate money going into universities and then corporations electing their own chairs, right? You were talking about this in the Majority Report recently, babe, I think, and you see, all these liberal arts programs being cut just for these, very bare and very technical sort of not very well-rounded educational requirements for the students, and certainly the rise of for-profit universities like Trump University. Something has shifted in the way that we understand higher education.
Yeah.
And that shift very much tracks with the political and economic shifts that we've seen over these years.
Now, how much of that is, it's like which came first, the chicken or the egg? How much of that is a response to a shifting economy? And how much of that sort of contributes to that neoliberal shift? Because I know when I was in college, like Columbia is still very principled about how, you're getting a broad liberal arts education in undergrad, and they're teaching you how to think and how to, come up with your own ideas and process the news and all that shit. And if you want to learn a trade, you have to shell out a bunch of money for grad school. And while that's a really nice idea and something I believe everyone should have access to, in practice, it tends to favor the students who are already very well off because, not everyone can afford to go to grad school. College itself is already really expensive. I know when I graduated college, I struggled for a long time figuring out what I could do for money in the world, and they did not help me at all with that whatsoever.
Yeah, the chicken or the egg thing is difficult, which is why I use the term functionalism, which is a really great cop-out because it simply says that the university functions in order to produce a particular social necessity that arises at a given time, right? So I'm not even making an argument that one follows the other, but I would say that universities as incubators of ideas and also creators of workers and also of elites will necessarily shift as the economy and culture and politics shift. I think what you see with the neoliberal university, which is the university of today, is really a breakdown of the social pact that the university was for these years, when it was this democratized classical liberal institution of free thought. I think more and more now it's becoming, and you see this, the university system is becoming way more crass. It's becoming way more expensive and bureaucratized. What used to be almost a public good used to be almost free when there were grants, and scholarships included.
CUNY was totally free, and now it's getting too expensive for some working class people.
And that happens with the fiscal crisis of the 70s, which kind of brings neoliberalism to New York and was kind of a trial run for the rest of America. Yeah, open enrollment has ended. Unsurprisingly,
that's
right?
a history that people should know about because, we've heard a lot of centrist Democrats talk about how, free college education, that's some crazy pie in the sky shit, when actually we had that up until very recently.
Every single one of my aunts and uncles on my one side of the family, and most of them on the other side, and both of my parents went to a state University of New York school, and actually every single one of them walked away debt-free from that. We're talking about people who went to college in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now, even in a public school now, think about what percentage of young people walks away debt-free. And again, this is not just that the universities are no longer seen as a public good, and that social pact is broken down, right? That this is something that we consider to be a public good that will be offered for cheap or free, to all people, right, in this country. It also, I think, shows that the university is becoming another place where, unlike that guild system that we saw, that survives into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and in some cases up into today with tenured professors, right? The university was also one of the last places that had a kind of old-timey, cooperative, non-market way of managing itself. And I think that, if power abhors a vacuum, capital abhors a vacuum of
This is a spooky
profit.
story.
Yeah. Could people hear the thunder and lightning? Oh. So yeah, I think that basically, bringing market forces into the university is a great way, not just to change what the university does, when you're pumping money into certain programs and taking them out of others, right? But it also is a way of, the same sort of financialization that has been happening under neoliberalism for the last 40 years can now take place in a university setting. And I think there's, $11 trillion worth of student debt right now in the United States. That is a massive amount of interest that banks and lenders are making. And,
Yeah, assuming they ever collect it, which is not a given at this point.
It's a huge bubble right now, and we'll see if it actually bursts. But I think you guys take my point, right? Which is that the university is now shedding this kind of, it was always kind of false, but this kind of like hallowed glow of, free exchange and old-timey traditional liberal values, and has become much more a market-driven device, much more something that's based on giving you very rudimentary skills instead of a broad classical education, and is also something that's trapping more and more people in debt, and also not even matching them anymore with the kind of jobs that it used to, when it was a ticket into the quote-unquote middle class. We don't see that happening anymore, even for doctors and lawyers at this point.
Definitely not. In this transition to a more bureaucratized, financialized, neoliberal, expensive model of education, was there any attempt to resist on the part of the old guard academics?
I think you've seen in general an attempt to try to keep these privileges and power that these folks have traditionally had, and I think that in many cases departments still have a strong core of tenured professors, but I think if you look at the statistics of how many teachers now in universities are tenured as opposed to adjuncts, I think it's flipped now, where the majority of people actually teaching classes are contingent, low paid, non-contracted, either graduate students or adjunct professors, and many of these people have to teach 4 or 5 classes a semester and still not be able to get by. So I think that, it's that privilege and power still exists for a small amount of people, but it's being eroded, and I think the struggle is not going to come from that old guard tenure track, right, that's still sitting there and their signatures up there. It's going to come from basically adjuncts who are highly exploited at this point in time, and I think importantly students. And then we've seen a bit of fight, over the years for students trying to reclaim some sense of what the university is, and also trying to change what it actually does and how it operates.
Yeah, so when I started going to university in the late 2000s, there was a number of emerging struggles around the austerity that was taking place on a state level, on a city level, on a national level, where universities were getting more expensive to live. Initially, I went to a SUNY school, and there began to be a centralization of the SUNY system, more standardization, more investment in the kinds of things that make more money for a school, like sports stadiums, for instance, and rises in tuition fees. And there was some struggle at the SUNY school I went to. Shortly afterwards, I went to the new school in New York, which has and that's why I'm hanging out at this new school occupation all the time, like some weird old guy. I'm like, I have like a little bit of an excuse. I'm an alumni.
You're not that old, come on.
I get older, the student occupiers stay the same age.
Yeah, compared to these kids, I'm incredibly old, and they have pointed it out.
What does that make me, like, I don't know,
Oh my
practically
God.
dead by their...
Like, this is the most selfish observation ever, but when I went with my DSA people on May Day to sing some songs and try to keep the morale up at the new school occupation, I was like, man, they look like children to me. Like I've gone through my life thinking that it wasn't that long ago that I was a college kid trying out my, lofty political ideas or, just doing drugs and having sex with terrible people. But actually that was like 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So good job, kids. Way to make me contemplate my death.
These kids are smart, though. I gotta say, I kind of like all of us our age, we fall victim a little bit to this propaganda about SJWs and hysterical campus libs or something.
I want to believe it's not true.
Because you see some they'll always distribute these vids of some very basically this has been going on since PCU, which was a movie that came out in 94 or something with Jeremy Piven.
Francis Fox Piven.
And Rush Limbaugh would always find these examples of one feminist group making kind of an overreactive statement and blow that up as if that's what feminism is and that's what college activism is. And that's still continuing, but now we have Trump and Kanye talking about it, so it's
Kanye.
It's kind of
talk about feeling old.
It's come to a head, even though nothing's really changed.
I mean, I was very impressed with their level of engagement.
Oh yeah, it was great.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Andy, doesn't this get to you were talking about SUNY, right? But then you started going to the new school. The new school has its own sort of particular history, right? When it comes to this, the university in exile and a different sort of model of education traditionally.
Well, without going too much into the backstory of the new school, because I don't really know it, it's got this, social research tradition, this, more or less Marxist tradition. And throughout the 2000s, there was a shift in the school with the appointment of Bob Kerrey as president.
Boo.
Bob Kerrey is an ex-senator from Nebraska.
War
He
criminal.
is a literal war criminal. He, I guess, unconvicted. But is a memorial to him in Vietnam.
Listen,
to the people that he killed.
If Kissinger got a Nobel Peace Prize, right, we can for sure say that Bob Kerrey is a war criminal.
I hope Trump gets one too. Just to continue to delegitimize the concept of the Nobel Peace Prize.
I mean, I would. Yeah, I thought you were talking about stringing him up, and I was going to say you can't say that about the president on a broadcast. But go on.
No strings.
No strings attached. NSA.
Not for our president.
So Bob Kerrey, throughout the 2000s, shifted the mission of the school away from this social research into Parsons, which was a fine arts school, and he shifted Parsons from a fine arts school into a design and fashion school. Which is a very good example of how the content of the school,
it's more about learning a trade.
And also the aesthetics.
Ideas.
It's more about aesthetics than art, than creativity and deep thought. And use that money to he would argue that it was to subsidize the humanities aspect of the new school, but also he used that money to tear down the New School for Social Research building and build the university that is currently occupied today, the UC, with student housing on top, which is obviously a huge moneymaker at 14th Street and Fifth Avenue. Towards the end of the 2000s, the faculty was getting really mad at the decisions Bob Kerrey was making, including packing the board of trustees with his rich friends. A lot of them were conservatives. One of them was on the board of L3 Communications, which is a major military contractor. So you started to see some kind of SDS. There's a group that actually called themselves SDS after the SDS in the 60s, making these anti-imperialist protests towards Bob Kerrey. But it really came to a head in 2008 when I don't even know what happened. Kerrey appointed himself provost or something like that.
I think he went through about 5 provosts in a year and finally just said, I'll be president and provost, which caused a complete rebellion. So this is a big reveal, but actually this is when Andy and I met about 9 years ago or so, was in the course of these struggles. So that's actually how I know the man, and I know him to this day.
Antifada lore for you there.
That's right. So yeah, it was, as you said, Bob Kerrey trying to throw his weight around in the university, and the professors, right, essentially, what do? They
had a vote of no confidence.
Right, yeah.
Which didn't take them anywhere. So some radical student groups met and decided to take some kind of action. And basically some international students who had the experience of occupying schools in Europe. I think this was a tradition that we sort of lost in the United States. Maybe, I'm not sure, because police started really cracking down on occupations or something like that. International students said, this is what you do. You go into a room, you build a barricade, you say, we're not leaving, you have some demands, you take over the space. And this was like a crazy idea to me.
What?
But the guy spoke so confidently, and he had a great accent. I won't say what it is.
But Andy, I'm just a consumer. I'm just buying my education. Why would I try to disrupt the workings of my own education when I'm paying so much for this valuable service?
Is this Sam? Who is that? Sam Cedar? Or?
That's just average, like,
Okay.
American student. I don't know why he has a Sam Cedar voice.
Sam would
but-
never say that.
But no, but the university is more and more in the United States, and this is, again, to get back what I was saying, seen as something that you consume, right? It's like a service, right? Not, it's, this endeavor that expands your mind necessarily, right? But it's something that you pay for and you expect a return on.
Yeah.
And an increasingly shitty service. So
Yeah,
you had students like me who just, I understood that the new school was supposed to be very radical and cool and prestigious, but I didn't really have any emotional attachment to it. So to take some sort of action against the president was a lot more interesting than, the paper on Nietzsche that I was writing.
I guess I was trying to get at earlier, talking about that neoliberal shift, if this is like just something that sort of happens naturally as the result of underlying material forces, or if it's like if it was a conscious decision on the part of people like Bob Carey to make this shift in the way universities are run.
Both. Do either of you know what the Powell memo was?
No? Tell
Oh,
us.
Wow, the Powell memo. We'll probably come back to this on the show, but to make it very brief, Justice of the Supreme Court, Powell, I forget his first name because we're doing this on the fly, he sat down with a business roundtable in the early 1970s and basically described to them in detail all the ways in which, as he called, free enterprise was being eroded in the United States. And he said that business needs to organize itself with conservative politicians in order to fight back against the corrosion of free market ideals. And what was the locus that he saw where most of these things were happening was the university. So business, when it reorganized itself in the 1970s and 80s, after it had been flat on its back after the Great Depression, does a concerted fight back against all sorts of institutions like unions, right? Like all sorts of public goods that were considered free now have to be paid for, and they certainly had the university as their target. It's when you start to see the first distinguished chair of such and such from Stanford University being funded by some billionaire somewhere. And the Koch brothers nowadays are the real embodiment of that. And it was a conscious effort. Now, I'm not saying that Bob Carey went there purposefully in order to create the ideal neoliberal university, but he comes out of a culture where the university needs to be reformed.
I think a lot of it had to do with competing with NYU, because NYU obviously became incredibly rich through just the buildings that it happened to own when that area of New York became the most expensive place in the world to own property. So NYU basically became like this real estate front, buying up lots of buildings, dorm buildings, hospitals. It became incredibly prestigious to go there, and it also started to sort of own New York City.
Yeah.
And New School wasn't content being this moldy old Marxist school a few blocks away. It wanted to brand itself in some sort of competitive way. I think Bob Carey was brought on as a prestigious president to do that. And in the process, he wasn't very interested in the content of the education. He was interested in the branding of the school. They spent a lot of money on rebranding it, which, by the way, it's rebranded since then. It was all money wasted.
Oh, great.
To the point where no one even really talks about the radical legacy of the school anymore. That's like a forgotten myth.
That was huge on my mind when I took the decision to take graduate classes there, because a lot of my radical friends had gone there for that reason before me. And I was like, yeah, if I'm going to, go to graduate school, I should certainly go to a radical Marxist place. That makes a lot of sense. I think that if the struggles, maybe we didn't even really know it back then, because there was a lot that went into those first occupations. There was the crisis happened right immediately when I joined in 2008. So the financial crisis happens in the U.S. You have the bailout of the banks. You have Obama being elected president real fast. And then the occupation comes right on the heels of that. I think that having this sense that you were in this institution that had a radical legacy, that had a critical legacy, we felt compelled as we were, just burying our heads in the books, Marx and Engels and his and the people that came after them trying to figure out what this crisis meant and how it affected us, we looked to the university as a way to understand that and to react to that crisis, but there was nothing there. It was an institution in chaos. So we, of course, being juvenile, thought that there was an A to B between crisis and social upheaval. We were like, oh, well, let's use this opportunity, as Andy said, not just to sort of push this very particular issue of trying to, beat back this Bob Kerrey monster and all of his, corporate raiders on the board of directors, but let's make a point about what kind of school we want there to be, and also start to react to this crisis of capitalism that we know is going to cause so much suffering. We did it in a very, again, kind of, I would say, in retrospect, juvenile, shallow way.
And what way was that?
Occupy the fuck out of shit.
Yeah, there's moonings. There was
moonings. Yeah. Drug use. Perhaps.
It was very much
Moonings.
like a Animal House style college party where we were like fucking with the dean, and the dean was getting angrier and angrier. Like, there's literally meetings when the dean was shaking his fist at us, but the pranks were all like
stupid kids,
very aesthetically ultra left pranks instead of like fratty.
Right.
Wait,
like if Jim Belushi was like,
we were chugging bottles of whiskey though. That was the same.
We were doing.
Marxist Jim Belushi.
Oh, that's a great character.
It was like
Where's
Revenge of the
Michael
Nerds
Brooks
and
when you
Animal
need 'em?
House and The Dreamers combined, or La
Nice.
Chinois. Yeah.
There was the time when Bob Kerrey showed up to try to talk to the occupiers, and he ended up getting chased down the street and getting rotten vegetables thrown at him.
Which
and
is
everybody yelled,
either funnier or less funny, depending on your perspective when you consider he only had one leg.
he had one leg blown off
no.
in Vietnam. Oh my god.
Ah, jeez.
If I had been part of that stream of people yelling obscenities at him running down Fifth Avenue, if I had been 5 or 6 feet away from that as it was all going down, I might feel really bad about myself today.
Well, you were in good company. I mean, you would have been in good company.
I
One of
been
the most famous philosophers in the world was allegedly there as well. So
There was a lot of hate.
Blind item.
But there was a lot of fun going on too. I mean, it was very heady times. These were connected to the times when I talked about that crazy fight that happened on Cook Street. Like that was like the
Yeah.
tail end
Yeah.
of that wild time in our lives.
Yeah, that's right about around when I met you.
So we were very juvenile, but it was also very resonant. And the rhetoric that came out of these occupations, sort of out of a reaction of the student activism that we thought was sort of along the lines of what the university wanted, like demanding more transparency, demanding sustainable development, demanding like a student on the board of trustees, basically demanding more representation in a structure that we didn't really have any faith in. There was the development of the idea of not having demands, of not asking for the university to be better, of not asking for student power, but asking for basically an insurrection against the logic of the school itself. And this led to kind of like a smaller wildcat occupation, which Bob Kerrey completely overreacted to, calling it basically a terrorist threat, having all the students like arrested and beat up and pepper sprayed, which eventually led to him not being the president of the school anymore.
It definitely didn't help that y'all were dressed like some scary anarchists.
That's how anarchists
standing
dress.
on top of the
Hey.
building
How
and
else
dropping your anarchist flags and reading your treatises into the megaphone. I mean, I thought it was really cool
Listen,
when Sean
very
showed
cool.
me.
That's just, the style you wouldn't understand. You're too young. But in 2008, 2009, wearing all black with a balaclava with a black and red flag and hanging signs off roofs, it's just what kids did. It's like nowadays they
It's a
play
different
with,
time.
what are those pogs? The kids are on the pogs today. Back then, we fucking, just threw insurrections. It was
I
a
think
thing.
you're thinking of porgs.
I think you're thinking of Tide Pods.
Ah, yes. Damn, I always get those things confused.
Yeah, it's an easy mistake to make.
Okay, so jumping to the resonance of this stupid bullshit we were doing, basically the literature of it, the images of it, spread a lot in the left. And folks in California, in the UC system, where tuition was going to be raised 30%, but this is like in the form of fees, basically.
Yeah.
Basically, it would cost 30% more, all at once, or like over the course of 2 or 3 years.
Severe austerity.
Yeah, that people saw the tactic of occupation as a way to push back against this. So there was an occupation at Santa Cruz that lasted for a few days. It's a very small one. That was repeated the next semester with a simultaneous occupation at Berkeley. And you started to see the tactic of occupation spreading throughout the UC system and increase in more or less militant ways, sometimes very militant, sometimes more like soft occupations, teach-ins, and that kind of thing. In the end, it was semi-effective. I think there was a tuition freeze for a few years.
And how did that feel for you guys to watch that happening after you got the ball rolling in such a substantial way?
We don't claim credit for anything on this show, not even being able to clean our rooms, which we don't even do. But,
we would not ever claim to take credit for that, babe.
it is true that when the Wildcat occupiers got out of jail a few days after the illegal occupation of the new school, one Professor David Graeber was there to greet them when they came out and then partied with them that night and the day after. And it was Graeber, several years later, who helped to spur the Occupy Wall Street movement.
I think I've heard of that.
Took what happened in a small scale at the New School and then a larger scale in California and put it, I think to everyone's surprise, on a national scale. With
international, really?
Yes. Well, there were like squares occupations and stuff happening all over the place. But yes, like joining with an international current of this sort of horizontalist, space-driven, occupation-driven resistance to austerity and in some cases capitalism itself.
Yeah, the tactic of occupation, it sent a message to people that we live in this world that we don't own, that we just pass through, and it belongs to someone else. Even if it's a public space, it's managed by these politicians that we don't vote for. They don't care about us. And the idea of occupation, whether it be at the school that you go to or in a public park, it spoke to people in this way that made them want to have their lives have some authority over their lives. They wanted to be in a place and actually talk to people and actually share food with people and create politics not in the alienated way of voting every once in a while, but politics in the very properly political way of talking to some strangers and figuring out what you want and what you want a situation to be. And I think that's what resonated so much. Not the demands of like get rid of Bob Kerrey or let's have more student power or something like that, but the act of occupying itself. I don't want to be too utopian about it because obviously you're occupying within a capitalist world. Even if they let you stay forever, you still have to rely on you're still a part of the capitalist structure until there's a revolution. But it gave people a little bit of a utopian glimmer in their eye of what life could be like.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because a lot of people have sort of mocked and criticized Occupy Wall Street because it didn't achieve the extremely broad, open-ended goals of, like, ending capitalism. But I don't think anyone thought that they were realistically going to do that. Like, as I understood it, it was much more about what you just said, creating an alternate vision of how things could be.
Well, it's interesting, by the time that Occupy Wall Street happens, I had dropped out of graduate school, not merely because I was crushed under debt and needed to, get a job, but also because I saw coming down the pike this adjunctification, I suppose you would call it, of higher education and didn't really see a place for myself. So I was already on my way to making the best decision I've made, which is to do what a lot of my family did and get a trade. So I was
you were already an adjunct at this. You've been adjuncting at this point in time.
And I saw no future in making $3,500 a class trying to live in New York City.
I was shocked when you told me how little money you made because, it still carries, like, even the word professor still has a certain mystique about it, and I was brought up to value education above all else pretty much because my grandpa Posner was a professor, and I just assume like, oh, you're teaching college classes, you're so educated and smart, you must be fairly compensated for that.
Well, of course, I think that's this hangover again from this sort of guild system tenured, public good conception of the free-thinking university that, has in many ways gone away. But by the time I'm at this place, right, and I'm like kind of exiting that world and don't want to complete a degree and just want to go get a job and all that good stuff, this Occupy Wall Street thing comes up. But by that point in time, several years later, I was so jaded by this conception of Occupy because all it did was like, throw some people in jail and shit popped off in California. And I was like, oh, this is never going to amount to anything. And then it happened. I think, Andy, you were at some of the meetings. I never went to the meetings for it. But, like, a couple days after it started, friends of mine who I trust politically started calling me, like, yo, something really real's happening. I'm like, what, from, like, an Occupy thing? They're like, no, shit's, like, really real. You got to go down there. So, like, a few days later, I went. I'm like, holy shit. I saw kind of what Andy was talking about, these possibilities that you saw in sort of the interstitial ability to create and take new space and create new relationships just spread out in this massive sea of people doing the stupid twinkle thing and doing the people's mic thing. And it seems kind of absurd again looking back on it, but at that moment in time it did feel like a real break. And these occupies popped up all over the country, almost almost simultaneously. Right after that, you had all over the country thousands and thousands of people being inspired by this vision. So I think there is something to that, right? When something like that resonates in that way, I'm not saying it's the end all and be all tactic or if it's the strategy or the goal that we should have right now, but I think, like Andy said, it does flip the conception of what our everyday life is and what it could be upside down.
I mean, let's not forget that the goal was the overthrow of the 1% by the 99%. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, as vulgar as that formulation is, I think at its heart, it was about class war, and I could have articulated that better. And obviously, a lot of the people that participated in it, because of the vulgarness of that slogan, went on to become, alt-right, Trump supporter type people. So that, that was a problem of its, like, populism. But I think at its heart, it was about more than just occupation. But the tactic, I think, was what really resonated.
Yeah, I think they also could have done a better job explaining to normal people what exactly they were trying to do. Like,
nobody had any fucking idea what they were trying to do.
Yeah, that is one problem one critique I would make of it. But, like, when you're looking at a list of demands, like, overthrow the ruling class and institute full communism, you're like, well, they couldn't possibly achieve that. They couldn't possibly believe they're going to achieve that. So what are they doing this for? And I think you've articulated some very good reasons that I wish were more widely known at the time.
Well, everyone had their reasons. Some people were there for legalized marijuana or whatever,
Yeah. Some people were there to drum.
Some people were there to
24/7.
end the Fed.
Yeah.
Jam on the bongos. So, I mean, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about Occupy as part of my personal history as well, because I was not that politically engaged before that. I mean, I did Food Not Bombs in high school, and protested the Iraq War, and that was kind of the high water mark of my political engagement for quite some time after that.
You hated bombs. That's all you knew.
Bombs,
Yes.
bad,
Yeah.
shitty vegan dumpster dive food, awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And you know what? It wasn't shitty. We made some delicious food at Food Not Bombs and passed it out in the Bushnell Park in Hartford, Connecticut.
Some rotten cabbage can go a long way when you put your anarchist mind to it.
Exactly. When Occupy happened, which was not that long after we met,
Yeah, a couple years.
it was, and I got to be part of it. It was very exciting to
You
me
were
and to a lot
trying
of
to meet
people.
David Graeber, but you met Sean instead.
I'm a poor man's Graeber.
Yeah, I'll take it.
For all the student debt that I racked up, I think for me it was personally worth it to go through that experience, meet those people, not only learn so much about the world collectively with folks in that setting, but also kind of wet my feet at trying to change the world through these occupations. That's something that'll always stick with me, and I think kind of grounded my mature sort of political life myself. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't give it up for the world.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And just to bring it forward in history a little bit to now, Occupy kind of wound down a little bit, and everyone was wondering what was going to happen next. And
A very unsuccessful general strike.
Oh God, that was a fucking
oh
disaster.
God, I remember that. I did not participate. I would think I was writing 7 blog posts a day at that point in
The
time.
working class wasn't ready.
What
I
if they
had
called a general
no-
strike and nobody came?
No, but one thing that did happen was Superstorm Sandy hit not that long afterwards, and a lot of the same networks that were formed during Occupy Wall Street, it seemed like a no-brainer. They sprang into action to do mutual aid, and I went down to the gravesend houses on Coney Island right after the storm, and nobody had been there yet. Not FEMA, not anyone. And we got there the same day. a little bit later, this big Christian group from Pennsylvania came in a big fancy bus.
They were Amish.
And they were not.
Oh.
They were not Amish. They were some
psychopathic.
There was some description of evangelical Christian. I mean, I'm not well versed in the different kinds of Christian.
They were monster people.
They did ask us if we believed in Jesus, and I was like, I'm gonna hold my tongue. It's not about me. But like, it was two very different models of aid work or charity, as they would call it. But two very effective models because nobody else was there. The government bureaucracy wasn't there yet. So that was, I think, a really cool, yet another way to show how our alternate vision for society could work in the present moment as well as the future.
You mean the Occupy Sandy mutual aid aspect, not the Pennsylvania psychopathic Protestant Christians rolling in there, gleaming van filled with racks of, pretzels and
coal.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think the people cared all that much who was helping them at that point in time. They still got to eat a chicken dinner that night.
I'm being flip.
Pretty cool.
I'm being flip, but yeah, like mutual aid, I think it is a very, very important thing, and mutual solidarity.
Yeah, and like the Occupy people actually went there and asked people what they wanted and what they needed from us before just like rolling in like, I'm gonna help you now, which is, I think, a key difference between charity and mutual aid, wouldn't you say?
I'd say so, yeah. And the hurricane relief efforts that were done on the grassroots level, horizontally and very, very effectively in those 7 to 10 days right after the hurricane, could not have happened if those networks of solidarity created during Occupy Wall Street had not arisen. And yeah, you're right, that network was tapped into. Since then, unfortunately, I feel like a lot of that energy is scattered, but I think that you can see now a reflection of that politically, not only in rhetoric, but also in this sort of rising left populism.
Yeah, I mean, people are critical of Bernie Sanders from the left for a variety of reasons. I also have some left critiques of him, but I think at the end of the day, his incredible campaign and successes, I mean, he didn't get elected, but, knock on wood, for all we know, he still could. This is the result, not the cause, of rising left populist sentiment and a growing awareness of class politics in America. I mean, he's been on the political scene for a long, long time, talking about the same stuff pretty much all the way through. And it's not a coincidence that he caught on at this particular moment in time. If anything, I think it shows how electoral politics are a trailing indicator, to use a phrase that I like to use a lot, of social movements and not the other way around.
Not to mention that bourgeois politician appropriated from the social movements the concept of the 99% versus the 1%, that capitalist pig.
We know Bernie.
He's talking about himself, or?
Yeah, that was himself talking about himself.
We know you're very conflicted. It's all right.
Bernie I don't think there's any conflict in his head, to be honest. I think he's a very driven social democrat.
Yeah.
I mean, we can have long debates about him, but I do think that it would be impossible to see the Bernie phenomenon arising if there hadn't been, not just rhetorically, but also in action, mass movement within this country, in the universities and in the streets, in order to try to recreate and create new visions of how everyday life and the world can be ordered, that his movement later tapped into in an electoral way.
Yeah. So basically, I guess what Sean is saying is that when Bernie Sanders is elected president and subsequently dissolves all the other branches of government and implements some sort of Maoist, top-down, full communist state, you will have Sean and Andy to thank.
And
You're welcome.
And finally, his wife can build the school that she wants to build, and we can occupy that school.
That's right.
Hell yeah. Let the circle be unbroken.
Let 1,000 occupations bloom.